Now, back to Alan Jones.
Thanks for being with us. We go to the federal panel, as I've said in many weeks, two very talented women, Concetta Fierravanti-Wells, the Liberal Senator for New South Wales, and Tanya Plibersek, very impressive operator by any standards. I did promise to return last week to this question of voter ID. You might recall that Tanya surprised us all by agreeing with Anthony Albanese's comment that, quote, voter ID is a desperate attempt to undermine our strong democracy and deny Australians their basic democratic rights. Now, I'll take a bet that if Tanya were the leader of the opposition, she wouldn't have said that. She's being overly loyal. But Albanese got even more nonsensical. I mean, I think he's on something. He said, on the eve of an election, the Morrison-Joyce government is trying to ram through a bill to stop Australians voting. This is a desperate attempt to undermine our strong democracy and deny Australians their basic democratic rights. He said, this is a cynical move to minimise the number of Indigenous Australians who get to vote. Now, I asked last night what he was talking about. I mentioned that in 2016, Malcolm Turnbull fell over the line in the federal election of July. Many people would say that for the nation's sake, that was a pity. However, I say again, I read a report yesterday in the Sydney Morning Herald, 3 months after that election in 2016, which Turnbull won by the width of a cigarette paper. And the report said from 2016, not long after the election, 3 months, more than 18,000 people have been asked to explain why they apparently voted more than once at the federal election. The story went on. Despite heavy fines and the risk of jail time for multiple voting, 2 people were marked off the electoral roll 11 times on July 2. A further 2 people had their names marked off 5 times, while 4 others had 4 marks and 51 people had 3. All up, 18,343 people were asked to explain why their name was checked off more than once. 6,700 of these multiple voting cases in New South Wales, 4,800 in Victoria, nearly 3,000 in Queensland. But if someone voted 10 times in the name of Alan Jones, if he's talking to me, how would they ever find the people who voted in my name? And the truth is, the votes are counted on the night, including the multiple votes, and they've not been able to establish who voted multiple times and who they voted for. How important is it? Well, unbelievably important. For example, if 5,992 people had voted differently in 6 electorates, Kevin Rudd would not have defeated John Howard in November 2007. If a mere 1,100 people had voted differently in 2 electorates, then in 2010 Oakeshott and Windsor would have been irrelevant. The coalition would have formed government. Neville Rand became Premier of New South Wales in 1976 by 1 seat, but in the seat of Hurstville, his margin was fewer than 20 votes. If people just in that electorate had voted several times, Neville would not have become Premier. So back to you, Tanya. This ID is to prevent multiple voting. Do you still support Anthony Albanese saying this is a desperate attempt to undermine our democracy and deny Australians their basic democratic rights?
Alan, I don't think anybody wants Australians lining up for hours on polling day, making it harder for them to vote. We know that there are a lot of Australians who don't have valid ID. In Queensland, 1 in 6 Indigenous kids doesn't have a birth certificate. We know this is a problem for homeless people, for people who've fled their homes because of natural disasters or domestic violence. We don't want to make it harder for people to vote.
Tanya, you know,
Alan, if this was a big problem, people would have been prosecuted for it. No one's been prosecuted. Big fines, but no prosecutions.
They can't prosecute them because they can't find the people. But there are the figures, 18,000 multiple votes. Now, you're not right in saying it stops people from voting.
Sorry. 18,000 people have been asked about it. That doesn't mean that they've all done the wrong thing, Alan.
Tanya, sorry, but you know that this legislation says that if you haven't got identification, you can use someone who can validate your identity. So you don't have to have the passport, you don't have to have, but you've got to have someone who can validate that you're Tanya Plibersek. Concetta, can I come back to you? 18,343 people in the Turnbull election of 2016 whose names were checked off the electoral roll more than once. I mean, surely, A, it's a problem, and surely the ID legislation addresses these issues. Yes or no?
It does, because it reduces the risk of voter impersonation by requiring voters to present identification documentation. Now, it does bring us into line with other liberal democracies, and other countries are also going down this path. Can I just be very specific? No one will be turned away on polling day. They will be able to produce a whole raft of different options for ID documents. And if, as you correctly say, Alan, that you don't have an ID, well, then somebody can attest to who you are, but also the voter can be issued with a declaration vote. So the options are covered. So I actually think that what the Labor Party is going on about is purely ideological.
Well, see, Tanya, I just want to come back because this lady is highly intelligent. I can't believe if she was the leader she'd say this. Whether we can agree or not, 51 of these people had voted 3 times. 4 others had 4 marks. 2 people 5 times. Your party's calling the proposal racist and discriminatory. Surely it's a simple proposition. Voters show a photo ID, a driver's licence, a passport, a bank card, or someone beside them to say, this is Tanya, this is Alan Jones. Tanya, what on earth can be wrong with that?
Surely, Alan, we want to make it as easy for every Australian who's got a legitimate vote to vote on a Saturday. And the other thing I have to say, Alan, is we've just come out of the worst part of the pandemic, and I can't believe that the Prime Minister's focused on this and not on jobs, the economy, rebuilding, reopening, making sure that we've got
but that doesn't
borders
invalidate
reopen.
That doesn't invalidate this, though.
Actually, it is troubling to think that this is his priority rather than getting the country back on its feet.
I think it is important, Tanya, because we've got to be sure we have the right people in government. And if there is multiple voting and voting fraud, we may have the wrong people on the Treasury benches. I mean, Concetta, Albanese said... Sorry?
I was going to say, even the Electoral Commissioner says this problem is vanishingly small. This is a government looking for a problem where nobody who observes these things closely believes there is one.
Tanya, 18,000 people, multiple votes. 18,000
people have done the wrong thing, Alan. Not one
and their votes were counted. Tanya, their votes were counted. And we don't know who they voted for, but they may have formed government. I mean, Albanese, Concetta, said on the eve of an election, the Morrison-Joyce government is trying to ram through a bill to stop Australians voting. He said this is a desperate attempt to undermine our strong democracy and deny Australians their basic democratic rights. Concetta, people out there in the pub listening to this think this bloke's on something.
Well, Alan, the reality is that voter ID aligns with very common civic activities that require ID. I mean, you need a driver's licence. If you want to open a bank account, you need ID. Even if you want to collect a parcel down at the post office, you need some form of ID. So, as I said, no one's going to be denied a vote because they don't have proof. There's ample opportunities, ample documents that they can show, and if they don't, there's a procedure there.
OK. Look, just coming back, since it is our last program together, and I've been very grateful for the contribution you've made, any progress, has any progress, you first, Tanya, been made in this urgent need to assist our school-aged children who've been appallingly abandoned in this coronavirus response? Tanya, you were the one who wrote so powerfully about this. Has anything been done? You were talking about priorities before. Has this got any priority?
Look, it's actually even worse than we thought, Alan, because the government set aside $25 million to help these kids. We found out in Senate estimates last week that they've cut that to $18 million and not a single dollar has gone to help a single child yet. They keep talking about what they're going to do. They've cut the funding and they haven't spent a single dollar. And Alan, can I just say, as we are finishing up, I was listening to you talking to Catherine McGregor earlier, that beautiful Tennyson poem that you read out. We need our kids to be able, they need to learn to read so that they can read to learn. That gift of reading that gives you fluency and enthusiasm and access to beautiful poetry like that. And also my other favourite, If, by Rudyard Kipling. And I thought, as we're quoting poetry tonight, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat these two imposters just the same.
And do you know
if
something?
If you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of...
you're a man, my friend. You'll be a man, my son.
Distance run, that's right.
Well, I tell you something, that is above the centre court at Wimbledon. That Kipling quote, as you walk onto the centre court and look back, there is that quote. But I want to make this point, Concetta. The governorship of Virginia, you may have heard me earlier tonight, saw the entrenched Democrats soundly beaten because the former governor, standing again, made the statement that, quote, I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach. Now, the Republicans went berserk with their election ads. The Democrats got smashed. But the point at issue here is, with coronavirus and homeschooling, and this was central to Virginia, parents gained an insight into what their kids were being taught. And a black lawyer representing the parents in Virginia said, quote, government education is exposing children to ideologies that are sometimes inconsistent with what the consumers, the parents, want their children to be exposed to. Tanya, I think this is going to be a big issue here. Concetta.
Well, Alan, it was a great result, and I think it reflects where the grassroots are taking back their country from the woke brigade. Can I just say, as far as the Australian government is concerned, in an answer recently in the House of Representatives, the Education Minister said he wanted the national school curriculum to reflect a positive and optimistic view of our history. Well, that's all very good. Now, let's show the necessary political fortitude as a government to make that happen. And overwhelmingly, Australians want their children to understand where our democracy comes from, the fundamental freedoms that underpin it, and more importantly, so that they can defend that democracy, just as previous generations have done so.
Absolutely, absolutely. Tanya, just a quick one from you to end. History and the economy are being taught, they said in America, through this prism of race. If the opposition were to win government at the next election, you may well be the Federal Education Minister. What would you do about this?
Well, I tell you what, Alan, I'd want our kids to learn to read and write and do maths. Under the Liberals, we've got the worst results in international testing in Australian history. Our kids have gone backwards. Of course, I want them to learn science and art and history and so on as well, but we need to focus on the basics first. And I'm a very proud Australian. I've said to you in the past and others that I think our kids should know about our democracy, including things like our citizenship pledge.
Absolutely.
And why it's so important that we commit to one another, to Australia and its people, to one another.
Thank you, Tanya. Well, we've run out of time, but it's good to talk to you both. Thank you both for the contribution, not that you've made to the program, but rather to the understanding and enjoyment of our viewers. So thank you both, and good luck.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you, and good luck to you too.
Thank you, Tanya and Concetta. We'll be back to wrap it all up shortly.